Now, a groundbreaking study has found that the African continent has started emitting more carbon than it stores. Now, this is partly due to a conversation of ecosystems, or rather agricultural purposes. To explain the study to us and break down what all this means are Dr. Yolandi Ernst as well as Professor Sally Archibald from Wits University. A pleasure to have you both on the program this afternoon. Dr. Ernst, I'll start with you. In your research, what were the most surprising findings about Africa's carbon emissions, also its storage trends over the last decade, and what implications do they have for the continent's future development?
Yes, thank you for having me in first place. I think what was a little bit surprising is that we are now a source of carbon instead of a sink. It's still very low emissions that we are releasing into the atmosphere, but I think, that was the most surprising of everything. The fact that we have fossil fuels and land use emissions increasing wasn't that surprising. Yes, so I think what was really interesting was that this whole study was based on so many different components and so many different estimates, and in the end we pulled everything together and made it happen.
Professor Archibald, let me go to you. There's this discussion on the importance of balancing carbon storage goals with biodiversity conservation and water management. Let's speak about how policymakers and stakeholders can navigate these competing priorities effectively.
Yes, thanks. That's a great question. I think it's clear that the most important way for Africa to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions is to find different ways to develop that don't involve burning fossil fuels and that involve agriculture that isn't quite so climate heavy the way some of the agriculture that we do today is. So it's really important that we, as a continent, even though we're a continent that's developing, that we don't develop through excessive fossil fuel use and from too much land conversion. But then there's also this possibility in Africa to try to store more carbon. I think one thing our study showed was that Africa really is a very big carbon sink still. There are still all sorts of natural ecosystems that are taking up a lot of greenhouse gases. And there's a lot of discussion in policy spaces and among sort of ways to fund sort of climate-friendly activities about how to manage, how to protect, and how to restore our ecosystems in a way that they take up more carbon. So that's something that's really at the top of many people's policy agendas. And it requires that we have the sort of data that we put together into the study. We need to be able to tell people these ecosystems are ones that are really good at taking up carbon. If you alter your land use in this way, then there's a little bit more carbon can come in and fewer greenhouse gases. So a lot of land management decisions now include thinking about carbon. But we mustn't forget that it's not only carbon we care about in Africa. We care about people's livelihoods. We care about getting enough water in the rivers. And we care about the amazing biodiversity. So sometimes you have to be careful that you don't just obsess about carbon and don't forget that we also need to conserve our biodiversity and make sure we have enough water.
Dr. Ernst, given the complex drivers of carbon emissions on the continent, what role do you see international collaborations playing in really mitigating the continent's carbon footprint, but also fostering sustainable development?
Well, I think it's really important that policy development look into how we do our carbon markets. The voluntary carbon market at the moment is not really benefiting Africa too much. And that will require people to invest, and not in ways that, is just greenwashing and, going with the business as usual. They will really have to invest in projects that change the livelihoods of people in Africa and that make a real difference. And that will have to be managed very well. On the international side, there's a lot of interest in the globe or around the globe to invest in Africa. But again, that type of funding needs to be managed very well, and it has to go to the right places so that the change can be, effective.
Professor Archibald, looking ahead, What are the most promising strategies or even initiatives that African countries can adopt to really transition towards a carbon-neutral future, but also ensuring economic growth and social equity?
That is the million-dollar question. I think there's a lot of potential for us to use alternative energy sources that aren't fossil fuels. The technology is advancing rapidly, and we are getting a lot of support. South Africa has been getting a lot of financial support, and many other countries, towards developing alternative energy sources. So that's key. And then there are some creative ideas around how to do what is called climate-smart agriculture. So no-till agriculture, where you grow plants without plowing the land. You can get as good production, even higher production on land where you don't plow it, but then you keep the carbon in the soil, because every time you plow, the carbon goes up. So there are some innovative ways that we can use our land and that we can still have a lot of energy that doesn't involve having such a damaging effect on the climate. But I think it is a big challenge. That's what our data showed. It was a surprise to us that even though our systems are taking up so much carbon, human activities on the continent are equal and more than the carbon that's taking up. Because there's a lot of us, and basically in order to provide enough food for us, to provide enough energy, it's a big challenge that's been given to Africa to develop, but to develop sustainably in a climate-friendly way. And we're going to need a lot of support, and we're going to need some really good policymakers who are on the ball, who know what they're talking about, and like Yolandi says, that can argue for the things that Africa needs to do them.
Dr. Ernst, how do human activities such as agriculture impact the balance of carbon in these systems?
So as soon as you have cropland activity, you typically either take out some of the natural vegetation or you actually plow up previous croplands, and every time that you do that, you disturb the soil and you release some of the carbon. If you take out some of the plants, those stocks are also lost. So mostly it's on the one hand the loss of carbon, storage, and then the other thing is that we put in things like fertilizer and we use electricity, which is at this stage mostly from fossil fuels, and we release carbon into the atmosphere.
And as a follow-up question, your study also suggests that Africa has transitioned from being a carbon sink to a carbon source over the past decade. Let's speak about the key factors driving this shift and how might it affect global climate change dynamics?
Yes, it's quite interesting. I think, if we continue in this path, we are really going to start contributing much more because we are a growing population with growing needs for resources. And we are still developing. So if we do not change our ways, we are going to contribute increasingly into the future, and that would be quite significant. But there is much hope that, at this stage, the globe is really, we have to do something. And I think, people do realize internationally that now is the time to do something and fund projects and fund ways in which Africa can, still, be a sink and go back to being, the place where the carbon is drawn from the atmosphere instead of being released. But yeah, that will require quite a bit of innovation and funding and everything.